While his boss battles domestic issues, US Vice President Joe Biden takes up the foreign policy at a conference in Munich. He says he's setting a new tone. But is it because America needs and wants its partners to share the burden, or simply because the unilateral policies of the past haven't worked? A new direction under a new president? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. So it wasn't the new president, Barack Obama, nor was it the top US foreign diplomat, Hillary Clinton. Rather, Vice President Joe Biden, who addressed the 45th Munich Security Conference, a regular get-together with representatives from around 40 different countries. The perfect platform, then, for Biden to talk about a new tone in America's relationship with the world, one where it would listen, it would engage, it would do more for its friends, but also ask for more in return. But why Biden? Well, one could say the role of the vice president was pretty much redefined by his predecessor, Dick Cheney, who played so active a role in the Bush administration, he was characterized the most powerful and influential vice president in history. Biden's not quite going down that track, but it was his foreign policy and his national security experience which was a big factor in him being chosen as Barack Obama's running mate. In fact, there was plenty of criticism, you might remember, of Barack Obama's inexperience in such matters. So is Joe Biden now the go-to guy when it comes to US foreign policy? We're going to look at that question and put parts of Vice President Biden's speech under the microscope with our guests. In Birmingham in the UK is Scott Lucas, a professor of American Studies at Birmingham University, the editor of EnduringAmerica.com. In Washington, D.C. is David Gartenstein-Ross, a vice president himself, this time from the Foundation for the Defence of Democracy. And in London is Rosemary Hollis, a visiting professor of international politics at City University in London. Many thanks to all of you for joining us. Before we get into the speech and look at segments of the speech, I want to ask you one question to each of you, and we'll start with Scott Lucas in Birmingham. And this is, I guess, what I'm calling a little section called "Who is Joe Biden?" How is he defining his role as vice president? Is he, with this speech and with his previous experience, now the sort of director of US foreign policy?
No, absolutely not. I think Joe Biden's important for the reasons you explained. He has experience. He has contacts with his fellow senators or his former fellow senators to try to get Congress to support the foreign policy. But he's only one of a number of key players. In fact, up until a few weeks ago, you could argue that the military was really emerging as having key roles in the Obama administration, say with the National Security Advisor, James Jones, with the likely director of the CIA, Dennis Blair, and even with key ambassadors, such as the next ambassador to Afghanistan, being former military people. I think now with Biden, with these military figures, but also with Hillary Clinton in the frame, Obama is looking for some kind of consensus to unite both the civilian and military approaches, but I think already he's running into difficulties getting that consensus on key issues like Afghanistan and Iraq.
Rosemary Hollis, same question to you. Where do you think Joe Biden fits in as far as US policy goes? Is he at the forefront of it?
I see him more as the balancing figure between Obama himself, who's setting the overall tone and theme of the administration, and Hillary Clinton, who's a very strong force in her own right. I was hypothesizing, supposing she had gone to Munich in place of the vice president, what message would that have sent? And I think much wiser on the part of the administration to send Biden, the vice president, because he speaks with the authority of the administration per se, as opposed to the State Department and the diplomatic arm of the administration.
Okay, and a thought from David Gartenstein-Ross in Washington, D.C. Who is Joe Biden? Where does he fit in?
Well, I agree with Professor Lucas that there's a number of different players, and Joe Biden is one of the players, probably, I'd say, the most important one, given that he's the closest to the president, that he is directly an administration figure. Another figure, incidentally, that Professor Lucas didn't mention on the military side is General Petraeus, who's now the head of CENTCOM, and has been formulating a new strategy for Afghanistan. That's also going to be extremely influential when it comes to the mix of influences that are moving U.S. foreign policy forward.
Okay, then, let's get into the speech now. We're going to start with a broad topic which came from pretty early in Joe Biden's speech there in Munich, addressing relationships with Europe, indeed relationships with the rest of the world.
America will do more, but America will That's the good news. The bad news is America will ask for more from our partners as well. Here's what we'll do, and what we hope our partners will consider. First, we'll work in a partnership whenever we can, and alone only when we must. The threats we face have no respect for borders. No single country, no matter how powerful, can best meet these threats alone. We believe that international alliances and organizations do not diminish America's power. We believe they help advance our collective security, economic interest, and our values.
Okay, let's go to David Gartenstein-Ross in Washington, D.C. for a thought on that. How much of a departure, or otherwise, do you think what we heard from Joe Biden there is from the previous administration? We often look at the previous administration as being very, if you pardon this phrase, gung-ho about exerting US influence, but I'm sure they understood too the importance of alliances.
Well, the interesting thing is that that's basically a boilerplate phrase. You can find a number of Bush speeches where he says basically the exact same thing. That being said, I do think that there's going to be a departure. I mean, one thing is that regardless of what kind of boilerplate came out of Bush administration speeches, the perception that everybody had was that the U.S. really wasn't listening to other countries. One thing that the Obama administration has seen a need to do from the very outset is to set a different tone. I mean, there's going to be a lot of questions, and it's far too early to resolve this, about how different the Obama administration's foreign policy really will be from the Bush administration's foreign policy. There are a lot of hard questions out there, and a lot of areas where I think they're not going to be able to depart from what the Bush administration did. That being said, I think that setting a new tone is a good thing, and I think that in reality, we will see that the U.S. will be much more attuned to listening to other countries and much more attuned to the message that it sends and the tone that it sets internationally.
Rosemary Hollis, what about the audience listening to that speech? Various countries around the world, in Europe particularly. Do you think they would be convinced that this is truly about partnership and not just about supporting the United States?
I think there's a great deal of relief across Europe, across the Middle East and beyond, that the abrasive tone, you're either with us or against us, has gone. And there is this expressing of willingness to work with allies. It's not unexpected that Biden talked about expecting more from allies as a result. This has been trailed for a long time as an expectation. I think there's nervousness about that aspect. It's principally, I think, the message that we're hearing here is we have different means of going about not totally dissimilar ends.
But isn't it going to be, and I'll put this to Scott Lucas in Birmingham, isn't it going to be, and correct me if I'm being too simplistic here, that just by virtue of the size, of the power, of the influence of the United States, that it is always, in the end, going to be seen as not the defining voice, but a defining voice in a conflict? You look at any conflict that happens in the world, you're always waiting for the United States to weigh in and see which side they're going to be on.
I don't think the Bush administration followed that. I think it projected itself that America was the defining voice, that it could remake Iraq, it could remake the Middle East, it could even remake relations with Europe. And I'm not as optimistic on Biden's speech once you get past the tone, because there's still an element of we lead, you follow. And in cases like Pakistan, the Obama administration is acting unilaterally already. I think the Obama administration has got to take a step back and really assess whether it wants to be the defining voice or whether it believes in a genuinely true multilateralism, which is cooperative with other countries. And I think Afghanistan will probably be the symbolic test case of that sooner rather than later.
Okay, let's leave Europe there and move a little bit further east and look at Russia, because this has been a big talking point that came out of the Biden speech. Let's have a listen. We'll talk after that.
The last few years have seen a dangerous drift in relations between Russia and the members of our alliance. It's time, to paraphrase President Obama, it's time to press the reset button and to revisit the many areas where we can and should be working together with Russia. We will not agree with Russia on everything. For example, the United States will not recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. We will not recognize any nation having a sphere of influence. It will remain our view that sovereign states have the right to make their own decisions and choose their own alliances. But the United States and Russia can disagree and still work together where our interests coincide, and they coincide in many places.
Right, so US and Russian interests apparently coincide in many places. Mr. Gartenstein-Ross in DC, what are those places?
I think there's two that Biden has in mind. One is U.S. missile defense, which has been very controversial on the Russian side. The U.S. in moving its missile defense shield into Poland, for example, this is something that has frankly worried Russia. And the Obama administration has been very skeptical of missile defense from the very outset, in part because they don't think it'll be effective. But I think that really the real reason undergirding all of this is the effect that they think U.S. development of missile defense and deployment of missile defense to Eastern European countries will have on the rest of the world. A second issue I'll mention quickly before getting to what I think is really going on is NATO expansion, which has also worried Russia quite a bit. Now, I think that really what is underlying all of this is concern for U.S. supply routes into Afghanistan. The U.S. supply routes, the caravans that have been going through Pakistan that have been supplying U.S. troops there and supplying NATO troops as well, have been getting attacked. And these attacks have become increasingly deadly and increasingly have disrupted U.S. supplies. It seems now that the U.S. is going to have to take these routes perhaps through some former Soviet republics where Russia claims a sphere of influence. We can already see in Kyrgyzstan, for example, that there's been an announcement that the U.S. base there would be canceled, in part because that's the quid pro quo that Russia is looking for to allow the supply routes to go through this area. I think that's precisely what Obama has in mind, which interestingly to me seems that in this area it's a shift away from the moralistic foreign policy of the Bush administration and signaling a return to realpolitik, not looking so much, for example, at the reconsolidation of power under Vladimir Putin, which is something that has not been reversed at all.
Let's go back to the missile shield. I'll do this with Scott Lucas again over in Birmingham, because I think this is a very interesting point. You know, it's a nice catchphrase which Joe Biden and President Obama came up with, resetting the button. Missile defense shields, missiles in Poland, whatever you want to call it, that's not easy to reset, is it?
It may not be easy to reset if they get opposition from the U.S. military, but politically, yes, they can do this. They can basically say, this effort for the past 8 years from the Bush administration to make this almost the #1 priority for American capabilities, we're walking away from that, and we're going to look at different political, economic, and military instruments for dealing with Russia, both directly and then with respect to other issues in Europe and in Asia. That, I think, was what Biden was saying. What I think is interesting about what he did not say was two things. The first is, I think he did not mention NATO expansion, which symbolizes the fact that the United States or the Obama administration thinks getting into the mess that happened over Georgia last August was not good for the United States. And secondly, he didn't mention Russian pressure on energy supplies, where Russia has exerted pressure on energy supplies for political gain. So I think the Obama administration is being very realist, but I think the idea that the United States and Russia are going to walk hand in hand on all these issues, no, we're into a very complicated play of power politics, to the extent that I think, for example, Russia will not accede to American demands to put more pressure on Iran in the short term.
And we'll talk about Iran in a moment. Rosemary Holt, so just get a thought from you, just what Scott Lucas was saying there about these two countries obviously not going to be walking hand in hand. Just on more of a housekeeping note, who do you think the US, Obama, Biden, whoever, who will they actually deal with? Is it Medvedev? Is it Putin? Will either of them worry, as George Bush did, about looking into their eyes and seeing their soul or anything like that?
I don't think they will actually worry. I think they've decided, by the looks of things, that they don't need and don't want a fight with the Russians over Eastern and Central European issues. What they want is cooperation from the Russians, as your other two speakers have said, vis-a-vis Central Asia, and I would add not just only on Afghanistan, but also Iran, as Scott Lucas just said. Now, Russian cooperation on those issues is essential if those issues are going to be success stories for the United States' new policies. And in the background, you have the SALT talks treaties that date back to the 1970s, which have reached the end of their life to do with the strategic nuclear confrontation between the United States and the former Soviet Union. And they need to be revisited. So here is a timely moment to say, let's not argue with the Russians, let's do deals.
Just a reminder, you're watching Inside Story, where we're dissecting the first major foreign policy speech by the US Vice President Joe Biden. We're doing that with the assistance of our three guests. In Birmingham is Scott Lucas, in Washington DC is David Gartenstein-Ross, and in London is Rosemary Hollis. Let's move on to the part of the world where I am, the Middle East, because that is obviously something which this administration has decided it will look at from day one. This is Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden, on the Arab-Israeli issue.
Senator Mitchell just completed his first trip to the Middle East. Above all, he went to listen. In the near term, we must consolidate the ceasefire in Gaza by working with Egypt and others to stop smuggling and developing an international relief and reconstruction effort that strengthens the Palestinian Authority and not Hamas. Neither of these goals can be accomplished without close collaboration among the United States, Europe, and our Arab partners. Then, we must lay the foundation for a broader peacemaking effort. In the past, well, let me put it this way, it's long time past for us to secure a just two-state solution.
All right, so that's how Joe Biden sees the Israeli-Palestine issue. Back to Rosemary Hollis in London. Surely, Ms. Hollis, this is the big no change. Obama has been all about engaging and all about talking, but I don't think there was anything in what we heard from Joe Biden that suggests any change from the previous administration.
The setting has changed slightly because of the Gaza war, and we had a clear articulation of the approach of the administration. There will be no rewards for Hamas in this. Hamas must be the loser overall. But in terms of listening to the players, we know that we've got the Israeli election coming up next week, and the odds are on Netanyahu winning at least the premiership and forming the next coalition. And we know that his position, harking back to his position when he was prime minister in the 1990s, is that the Palestinians should have autonomy, not statehood, in the West Bank and Gaza. And he's also pledged not to give up the Golan Heights, which would be an element in any future talks with the Syrians. And he's pledged to keep Jerusalem united. This is not the makings of a two-states deal, quite the contrary. So if the Obama administration is in listening mode, they're going to have to go with the grain of what it is that the players on the ground are after.
David Gartenstein-Ross in DC, what do you think about that?
I think that there is a change, and that change is that during the 8 years of the Bush administration, there was never any sort of push on the Israeli-Palestinian front. I think just the signal that they're going to be looking at the issue and trying to move it forward is a change. I agree with Professor Hollis that there's only so far they can go. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, since the Clinton administration, something that every president wants to solve. But it's one of the more intractable conflicts out there. So I do think that at least the signal that the administration cares about the issue and will devote some diplomacy to it is an important one. But realistically, there are limitations to what they will be able to accomplish.
Scott Lucas in Birmingham, there was a part of that little soundbite we heard from Joe Biden which probably wasn't surprising, but I still think it was interesting. It was when he said relief and reconstruction efforts that will strengthen the Palestinian Authority and not Hamas. Again, probably not hugely surprising, but there is still that remote possibility that Hamas and the other Palestinian factions could get it together at some point, and then surely that will constitute dealing with Hamas, strengthening Hamas as part of the whole Palestinian body. Is that going to happen?
I think you've got to go back to what you just said, which is what the Americans tried to do yesterday in Biden's speech, which is very dangerous and has them in a corner. And that is, before you have meaningful talks with all the players in the conflict, which has to include Hamas, what they're trying to do is weaken Hamas, possibly even overthrow it, or at least undermine it, and bring Fatah and the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. Frankly, that's a ludicrous strategy. I don't think a lot of players in the region, even if they do not like Hamas, think that is a viable strategy. And what the Americans continue to do, which says it's first we're going to have a strong Palestinian Authority and we push Hamas out to the side, what they do is they put themselves into a very unrealistic position. Now, maybe privately, the Americans are pursuing a more sensible strategy. That is possibly working through a channel, such as the French or such as an Arab state, to establish contact with Hamas. But unless they're doing that, they basically, they're on a road to a losing strategy, and we're not going to get any advance on the Israel-Gaza-Palestine issue.
Rosemary, just a quick reaction from you, because I want to move on to Iran, but you were shaking your head there.
Yes, indeed. Actually, I think that it's going to be disappointment on the Middle East front, and that's a signal, a danger signal for the Obama administration if they build up hopes that they can actually implement a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They're setting themselves up for failure.
Right. I mentioned Iran. Let's talk about that, because as we've seen, the administration perhaps not happy about talking to Hamas, but certainly entertaining the idea of talking to Iran.
Our administration is reviewing our policy toward Iran, but this much is clear. We will be willing to talk. We'll be willing to talk to Iran and to offer a very clear choice. Continue down the current course, and there will be continued pressure and isolation. Abandon the illicit nuclear program and your support for terrorism, and there will be meaningful incentives. Second, we'll strive to act preventively, not preemptively, to avoid, whenever possible and wherever possible, the choice of last resort between the risk of war and the dangers of inaction.
David Gartenstein-Ross in Washington, D.C. Why extend the hand to Iran in this manner? I think it goes back to the old, what was it, unclenching. If you unclench your fist, we'll extend our hand. Why do it to Iran and not Hamas?
I think that their view is that Iran's been around for 30 years. It's had power. It's not going anywhere. And realistically, if you're to try to delay its nuclear development or stop its development of nuclear weapons, then you have to talk to them. Otherwise, your choice, as Biden said, is between war and certain Iranian nuclear development. On the other hand, Hamas is in a much less politically stable situation. It's a younger organization. It's only recently come to power in Gaza, and their view is that it's an organization that can be weakened, and moreover, that it's not particularly a reasonable player or reasonable partner for peace. I think that is the thinking behind Biden's distinction vis-a-vis Iran and Hamas.
And I guess, Scott Lucas in Birmingham, dealing with Iran could perhaps be seen as an in, if you like, a way in to some of the deadlock places in the Middle East. If you get talking to Iran, then you might be able to talk to Syria, and Syria is talking to Israel, and Syria and Iran have influence over Hamas and Hezbollah. It all kind of goes around in a big circle.
I'm not sure it's that Iran is at the top of the pyramid there, but certainly you have to recognize that Syria, Turkey, and Iran in recent weeks over the Gaza conflict have set up, as it were, an alternative bloc. So that's one issue. There are two that I think are even more important, and far more important than the nuclear issue. And that is the question of Iraq, where Iran does not control what happens in Iraq, but it is a key regional influence in what happens there. And Afghanistan, where if you're going to move forward with a political approach in Afghanistan, you have to do so at some level in cooperation with the Iranians, especially over the western part of the country. The real question that we were waiting for this weekend is not just Biden's public statement, but whether there were informal private talks between American and Iranian officials, because there was a good likelihood that that was going to take place. It'll probably take a few days before we get a reading on that, but I think, in contrast to my fairly negative outlook on what's happening with Israel and Palestine, this is a sign that engagement could be a positive development for the U.S. and Iran and for countries beyond those two players.
Okay, just before we go, Rosemary Hollis, I've got time for one last word from you. Where do you think, or how do you think Iran will react to this sort of talk?
I think the Iranians are divided over how to react. There are those who want to engage the United States, but there are those who realize that that will remove their victim status.
Well, between the three of you, I think we've solved all of US foreign policy problems. My thanks to Scott Lucas, David Gartenstein-Ross, and also Rosemary Hollis. Many thanks for joining us. Great discussion today. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments, your suggestions. You can always send them to us at that email address right there. It is insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, goodbye for now.